My name is Louise. I'm the chair of Canyon Dems, for the few of you who may not know me already. And I'm thrilled that we're all here together. And I have a short formal introduction of Katie Porter. For most of us is necessary, but I do it anyway because it's kind of the way you do these things. We're actually very that UCI opened a law school a few years ago because it brought a lot of bright young faculty to the Orange County campus. People like Katie Porter, who came to Orange County from the University of Iowa Law, having her degree at Harvard Law. Until Trump was elected, Katie was a working mom with 3 children living at UCI in faculty housing. And then other people, she decided we could not put up with the Trump administration, and she decided to run for Congress. Katie was part Blue Wave, elected in 2018. She joined the House of Representatives and has been serving on the Committee on Financial Services and the Committee on Oversight and Reform, much to the dismay of corporate CEOs and lawyers who try to duck her questions with corporate puffery. We learned that Katie may have been elected as the Blue Wave, but she's really called something else. I call her the Blue Tornado, okay? Because she blows down the testimony that tries to avoid straight answers to tough questions. Canyon Democrats are excited to have Katie meet with us. Canyon Dems have suggested questions that Katie will address at the end of the presentation. We urge you to look at our electronic newsletter that went out about noon today, where there are links for you to make phone calls for Katie. Please sign up to make the calls. We really need your help. And Katie, thank you for your outstanding representation of us in Washington, D.C. Thank you. And I think we're going to turn it over to Katie.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Louise. It's really great to get to see so many of you and really, really brightening my day to get to see so many familiar faces. So thank you, everyone, Canyon Dems, for having me and for joining with me today. I just wanted to start by giving you the briefest update about our campaign, and then I want to turn really to talking about what our country is facing as a whole and reserve most of our time together for questions. So just a huge thank you for brightening my day and bringing us all together virtually. And so with regard to our campaign, I hope you all saw that we placed in first place. We made it through, obviously, in the top 2 primary. It's certainly a big change from the nail biter that I had 2 years ago with so many wonderful, strong primary opponents then. But we're going to be facing off against Greg Raths, who I know many of you in Canyon Democrats, because you're residents of Mission Viejo, know well. The good news for our campaign is that in the months since November of 2018, with a lot of hard work from you all and from Field Team 6, from Democratic Party of California, Orange County Democratic Party, voter registration has narrowed. So the Republicans currently are R+3. That means there's 3% more Republicans than there are Democrats. That still means that if turnout were equal between Republicans and Democrats, we would lose. So it's really, really important that we turn out those no party preference voters and that we have really, really high turnout. And it's going to be a challenge to figure out how to do that. I was just saying that I probably feel more worried about November now than I have any time in the last year. And partly it's things like seeing that UCI campus emptied out, and knowing that there are 20,000 votes on that campus and we won by 12,000 votes. So if those students don't come back, or if they come back and circumstances are different, we're going to have to be really creative about how we engage people if this situation either continues or if we have a kind of social distancing go off and on, or we have to change kind of some of our strategies. So it's really, really helpful to have a large volunteer base and to have so many wonderful people supporting us, because that's going to let us be creative as we go into this election season. Special thank you to those of you who are making well check calls I really, really appreciate it. And we're having a virtual volunteer event on Thursday evening. And so I'm looking forward to hopefully getting to talk with some more of you then about the campaign. With regard to Congress, I will tell you that I'm a pretty hard worker. I always have been. I thought I was working as hard as I could be, and then this pandemic happened. And it's been even more of a challenge. Part of it is trying to figure out how to continue to show constituents and the American people that we in Congress are holding the administration accountable, that we are working on legislation, because we don't have some of the obvious things to show people. We don't have televised hearings. We don't have the House floor and the voting. But I want to assure you that every day I have conference calls with House Democrats, everything from calls with small groups of people who I'm working on certain initiatives with, to large conference calls. Today, for example, I had a call with the Financial Services Committee with Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin. I also had a call yesterday with the Democratic caucus, all 200 plus Democrats in the House. Today we had a freshman call with Speaker Pelosi. And so there are lots of those things going on. I just signed off today on yet another resolution and letter encouraging the House to develop a plan for how it will cope, a contingency plan for continuity of operation procedures during times like this. So I continue to be an advocate for remote voting, for figuring out how to do remote hearings, so that my constituents can have more of a window into this work that I'm doing. The last big conference call I got off on was I think Wednesday. And I got right off that conference call and hopped on Twitter and did a Twitter live reporting to the American people what I had learned on that call, because I think we all are worried about whether we can trust the information we're being given, and trying to get information about both this pandemic, but now of course also the economic consequences of it. So been working very hard with all of that, also doing a lot of constituent outreach. My staff's working very, very hard on the official side to return calls to constituents. We're trying to return those calls personally, not send form letters, but pick up the phone, call people, help guide them to resources in our community, whether it's small business, whether it's unemployment, whether it's the need for food assistance. So we're working very hard, and I've been doing my fair share of constituent calls as well, which is really both important for me to be hearing those voices, and also really rewarding to feel like I'm able to help people and be as much as I can to be reassuring during this time period. With regard to Congress, we're looking at a new legislation coming up in the next couple of weeks, hopefully soon. And that legislation will be designed to increase the funding to hospitals and frontline providers, to localities, including smaller cities, and to the PPP program, which is the Paycheck Protection Program, which is a very popular program that was just rolled out and made operational 8 days ago, and has already had $297 billion that has been approved out of it. So we're going to need to top up that and put more money in that, so more small businesses, especially our smallest businesses who may have the hardest time getting through the application process, are able to have an equal chance to get those resources and continue their small businesses. So we're working on that. We've tentatively been told that we're going to try to return to Washington the first week of May. And I'm hopeful that at that time we will take a vote that would change the rules to permit remote voting should it become necessary going forward. Because I think one of the things we're likely to see is, we've already seen this, but we're going to keep seeing it, is yes, this is a global pandemic, and there is likely going to be almost no nation or no place that is wholly spared. But it's also having regional outbreaks and different regional effects. And so there may be certain colleagues who are not able to travel when others are. And we want to make sure that every group of constituents has their voice heard in Congress. My other big passion, as many of you know, is oversight. And I'm used to doing that through the hearing process and being able to question witnesses. So that's something that I miss doing. And we've been trying to figure out how can we convey to the American people the level of oversight that Congress is conducting and needs to conduct, particularly with regard to this administration's handling of the pandemic, which has been very troubling in many, many ways. And so we need to do something, I think, to counter the president's briefings, his press briefings, which I think are destructive and show a disregard sometimes for the truth. And so I've been pushing my colleagues in the Democratic House majority to try to figure out how and why we can do something to counter that information and misinformation that sometimes is being put out. So with that, I will turn it over to Louise, and happy to take your questions.
Okay, the first question is from Peggy O'Neill. And I was surprised our members wrote some long questions, so bear with me, okay? Please clarify the situation with testing for COVID-19. Private companies have popped up, one promoted by your opponent, that for $200 to $400 will test for COVID-19. How are they getting access to the tests when the impression is that doctors' offices and other places don't have them, and ERs are limited in who can get a test? Second, per legislation and CDC regulations, as you have previously explained, provide that the test be free of charge. Why are people being charged or having to provide insurance information? Will they be reimbursed for the copay? And what is the process? Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so these are terrific, terrific questions. So let me take the first one first, which is about the availability of tests. So obviously nationwide, and particularly in some regions, including here in Southern California, we have had shortages of tests. Some of that isn't test kits per se, it's reagent, which is something that they use to do the actual test after the specimen's taken. We've also had backups at some of our labs, including our Quest lab in San Juan Capistrano. They had a big backup of test kits. They took in more test kits than they were able to process, and they sat there. What's been going on with some unscrupulous actors is they have been attempting to sell to the public tests that are not authorized or approved by the FDA. And so these tests that some people are advertising online are not FDA authorized. They're not approved to conduct coronavirus tests. They may produce invalid results. The official coronavirus tests themselves that are FDA approved, we believe have a false negative rate of between 20 and 40%. So very, very high already. So I want to be very, very clear with you that while more testing is critical, as I learned from my own experience, when I was sick 2 weeks ago, the doctor called, he said, "You're negative for the flu," before I left the office, because the flu test is rapid. 3 days later, 72 hours later, they called back and said, "Your coronavirus test was negative." And I said to the doctor, "I feel relieved." He said, "I wouldn't. I would assume you have coronavirus. I would continue to pretend that you have coronavirus. You have symptoms, you had a fever, you need to just continue to act as if you had it, because the testing is not 100% accurate." So we are working to refine those tests, to create more rapid tests, to distribute those rapid tests. And what's happening as the government and as so many private healthcare providers are working to do this is we're seeing certain people come into the marketplace and try to scam the American public. So I wrote a letter to 3 companies, I believe it was, that were selling at-home testing kits, none of which were authorized by the FDA or had been approved by the FDA as safe. When you have a coronavirus test, the swab is taken out of the very, very back of your nose, where your nose connects to your throat. So this is not something that necessarily people are going to be able to do at home. So we wrote a cease and desist letter to those companies, and the FDA took action and demanded that they remove those tests from the marketplace. We're now trying to get those people's money back, because these at-home tests were also hundreds of dollars. With regard to coverage for testing, so I had my exchange with the director of the CDC back I think the second week of March. I think it was March 12th or something, when I managed to get him to say he would cover the testing. And to be clear, what I was pinning him down on was a commitment to use an existing law that Congress had enacted many years before, a couple of years before, that contemplated needing free testing, treatment, isolation, and coverage during a public health crisis. So Congress did its job here. It passed this law. There is this rule. The CDC had it at its disposal, but it wasn't willing to use it, right? And that's, I think, so much of the story of what we see with this administration is there are tools like the National Strategic Stockpile, and yet the administration fumbles and messes up using those tools. So after I got that, after that exchange with the CDC director and I got that commitment, 3 days later in the middle of the night, March 14th, wee hours, we passed the Families First Act. That also provided that testing would be free. We then, in the CARES Act that passed at the end of March, provided again, we restated that testing would be free. But as you know, people are being asked to pay copays. And so I think what's going to happen is that when these go through the explanation of benefits and the insurance processing system, we'll see that they'll come back with, for instance, zero, like it won't be applied to your deductible. Anything you pay will be refunded from your provider, and the way the explanation of benefits will be handled will correct this. But I'm not confident that insurance companies are going to get this right. So I think there are going to be people who are going to be doing battle with their insurance companies over the testing. But what really is expensive is getting admitted to the hospital and having to stay in isolation and be intubated and need ICU care. So I think we need to be pivoting to the costs of treatment. And even today, one of the things that we talked about as House Democrats were the fact that there are many families in New York, a city in particular, but across the country, who do not have the resources for burial costs, particularly as some of them are losing 2 or 3 family members within a matter of days of each other. And so what can we do to make sure that these families that are grieving and have lost somebody are able to bury their loved ones in a way that is consistent with their religion or their preference or their tradition. So absolutely expanded testing is needed. I have a great deal of confidence that Speaker Pelosi and the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Frank Pallone, are pressing as hard as possible on this. I think the insurance piece is going to prove to be a big back-end mess that I stand ready to question those insurance executives about when we get back to Washington.
Okay. 2 of our members, Steve Fike and Diane Nixon, both asked questions about the U.S. Postal Service. So the first one was, what will you do to save the U.S. Postal Department from being dissolved by Trump administration? And then Diane asked, how do we save our post office? So.
Yep. The president's attitude toward the post office, in my opinion, borders on, frankly, unpatriotic. He's very, very opposed to the continuation of the post office. He has it in his head that somehow the post office exists primarily to help Amazon and Jeff Bezos. He doesn't seem to understand that we all rely on the post office to deliver critical information to us, whether it's a letter from loved ones, whether it's a bill, whether it's civic information, whether in California, for instance, it's our ballots. So we absolutely have to protect the post office. The post office was in trouble long before this pandemic came along, largely hampered by the fact that Congress passed a law several years ago forcing the post office to pre-fund its pensions like 15 years out, which is something that we don't put on any other public or private enterprise. So this is strictly a rule that was put on the post office and largely designed, and it was passed under the guise of trying to make the post office fiscally accountable, but really they're sinking under that because no other business or government agency could pre-fund their pension like the post office is being asked to do. So in the short term, the post office needs an appropriation. They need Congress to appropriate money so that they can continue to meet payroll and continue to deliver mail services and have them at the ready. The post office itself estimates, an oversight committee had a hearing informal hearing. I put hearing in quotes. It was we have to call them forums or briefings, but we had a conversation with the Postmaster General. He says that after 9/11, after that recession, mail dropped by 10 to 20% and never came all the way back. So it's likely that as we've seen mail drop because of this pandemic, some of that will bounce back slowly as the economy recovers, but some of it won't, which is going to mean we really need to be looking at long-term solutions for the post office. I'm a big believer in the postal system, in door-to-door delivery, in the role that they play in our community. And I've heard from a lot of seniors before and during this pandemic, how much the fact that they know their post person is coming to their door or coming to their mailbox means to them. So particularly in rural communities, that might be the only person that is out there in any proximity to that family or that home during this time. So Democrats are well aware of this problem. Trump is being really obstinate about this, above and beyond even his usual self. So this is going to be a fight. I think our best hope is to enlist Republicans in supporting the post office. A lot of them represent rural areas where the postal service is very important. And so I think this is something that actually both parties are going to have to come together on, and then unfortunately force the president to take action because he's got this in his head that somehow the post office is out to get him. And so it's a real challenge, but thank you for the questions. It really is a big area of concern, and we probably have another month or two, maybe 3, before the post office will run out of funding under the current conditions. So it is something that we need to be acting on in hopefully no later than May or June.
Oh, it's so interesting. Everything seems to be up for grabs, you know, nothing works right. There are 2 questions from Herb Cohen and Martin Oblia about the Supreme Court. What do you think is that the Supreme Court will rule on cases related to assess President Trump's tax returns prior to the 2020 election? And then the second question was, the Supreme Court has recently shown decidedly partisan bent on immigration, voting safety, coronavirus, Trump tax returns, et cetera. Is there a legislative remedy to restore justice to the court?
Yep. So let me take the second question.
Easy answer.
Yeah.
Easy
Let me take the second
right?
question first. There is no easy fix for the Supreme Court. There really isn't. And this is really baked into the structure of our democracy, what's happened in the court. And so while there may be rule changes in the Senate that could be enacted to help a little bit, the reality is that the administration has done a terrible damage to the Supreme Court, and that damage is going to be with us for a number of years to come. The presidency is incredibly important in its own right, but it also is the way in which we're going to be able to influence the course of the Supreme Court. So I wish there were a quick fix, but if anybody tells you there is a quick fix for the Supreme Court, that's wishful thinking, to be perfectly honest with you. I also want to flag and encourage you all to get involved in watching what's going on with the appointment of federal district judges and federal appellate judges, because that is really because of the numbers of those judges. Hundreds and hundreds of those folks have been appointed by the Trump administration. And many of them will be in office for 20, 30, 40 years. And so, the Supreme Court, one justice passing away and replacing it with another justice really does change the composition of the court. But what Trump and McConnell have done with the lower courts, with the district courts, is going to take decades to reverse. And particularly for consumer class actions, for employment claims, discrimination claims, so many kinds of cases, immigration claims, these will never get to the Supreme Court. So in essence, that district judge is the final arbiter of what's going to happen to so many of these cases. Big corporations and big nonprofit groups, our constitutional rights, things like the right to have an abortion, those kinds of rights, they'll get battled all the way to the Supreme Court. But for an individual trying to appeal, for instance, a ruling against them that they're entitled to asylum in this country, there's no remedy beyond the district court as a practical matter for those families. So I want to mention how important it is to really look at the judiciary as a whole and understand that what we see going wrong at the Supreme Court is really, truly the tip of an iceberg in terms of the corruption and change in our judicial process. The first question I'm trying to remember, what do I think the Supreme Court will do with regard to ruling? So they've begun having telephonic hearings. And so they've started that this week. This is actually used pretty widely in appellate arguments. So this is not, so the judiciary actually has some experience in doing arguments by telephone. And so hopefully this will allow the court to continue to take up and issue decisions. Typically we see the decisions issued in June, July. So I'm hopeful that we don't see a delay. I personally do not think Trump will ever release his tax returns. I think even if the Supreme Court rules, we'll then have a president who flaunts a Supreme Court ruling. And we're trying to figure out what is the remedy for that, right? And you know, this is a president who, as he says, his authority is total. And so it's just extremely hard to figure out, even if we get that favorable Supreme Court ruling. And I do think the law is, I'm not even going to say I think, let me just tell you, the law is crystal clear that upon the request of the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, he has to turn over, the Treasury Secretary has to turn over the tax returns. So the law really here is very clear. The problem is getting this administration to cooperate. And it's not clear to me that even if we get a Supreme Court ruling, that Trump will obey it. And that creates a whole nother kind of constitutional crisis.
Mm-hmm. But we can solve it on November 3rd.
That's right.
Yeah. So 2 questions regarding elections from Annie Krinsky and Cindy Ashley. What can we do to help ensure the legitimacy of the 2020 election? And the second question, what is being done to make sure that the November elections are secure and all voters in the US have access to voting?
Yep. So here in California, as you know, and particularly here in Orange County with Neil Kelly, I have a high degree of confidence in our voting process and procedure. And I know more than I wish I knew about what happens and how ballots get counted. And I had a lot of 9 days last time to learn a lot about that process. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is say, look, California, Oregon, Washington, these are all vote by mail states, and Oregon has been exclusively vote by mail for quite a long time. So there's lots of models for this. What Congress is trying to do is a couple things. One is we appropriated some money in the CARES Act that can be given to states to fund these kinds of voting security procedures, to expand vote by mail, and to make investments in voting infrastructure. The problem, of course, is that secretaries of state are elected. And we have some secretaries of state in certain states who do not share our country's foundational belief in democracy, and instead are willing to engage in voter suppression activities, including purging voter rolls and other things like that. Even, you know, as they claim this is to stop voter fraud, President Trump himself tweeted out earlier this week, might even have been on Easter, I can't remember, that, you know, voting by mail causes widespread voter fraud. There is zero evidence of that, zero. And his effort to have a commission to expose this, there was none. We're going to hear a lot of this locally too. So I want us all to be prepared also to address this locally. The Republicans have been pushing this narrative that each of us in Orange County who won did it because they would say we ballot harvested. That is a pejorative term. It is not correct. It does not reflect how ballots are actually collected and distributed. And so we're going to see a lot of efforts to undermine people's confidence in the integrity of Orange County and California elections. Even though we don't have a practical problem here, there's a disinformation problem that can discourage people from voting. So Congress is trying to appropriate more money, and that will help some of these states that do want to make sure that they have fair, full, and accurate and secure elections take action. But we also need to support electing secretaries of state who are Democrats in other states. And there's a group called, Nora's going to make sure I get this right, but I think it's called I Vote.
That's right.
And what they do is they work to elect Democrats to Secretary of State offices across the country. Traditionally, secretaries of state, those races, you know, there are not very many donors. They're kind of underfunded. They don't put up TV commercials. They don't have resources to do field. So consider volunteering or supporting one of these Secretary of State races in some of these red states, where in November we can elect different people to be running our state election systems. And that's a great initiative. Your political committee may want to look into picking a couple of those states for Canyon Dems to adopt and support the Secretary of State candidate in those places.
Okay. Linda Eleanor writes, given that town hall meetings are a thing of the past during the coronavirus shutdown, what are the best ways of gathering community issues, sending them to our representatives? Are you planning virtual town meetings in any ways?
Yep. So we have done telephone town halls. We've done a couple of those. We have done a Twitter Live. We have done a Facebook Live. We've done some of these kinds of Zoom calls, and we've done some conference calls. My staff is all still working. Our office is physically closed, but we are all still taking emails, taking phone calls. If you leave a message, you'll get a call back. And so we're hearing from, actually, sadly, record numbers of constituents because they are in trouble and they need help. And so these are challenging calls for us to resolve. They're not kind of traditional congressional casework. They're not sort of help me with my agency. I submitted my paperwork and I haven't heard back. These are really people who are saying, I'm going to lose my home to foreclosure. What should I do? I can't make my mortgage payment. My small business is shutting down. My employees need help. What can I do to help them? And so my office is providing, like I said, one-on-one phone calls. We have a wonderful partnership with the Small Business Development Center, which is an SBA-funded program that's physically located at the Cal State University Fullerton Irvine campus. So it's right in the 45th Congressional District. So I'm doing an upcoming event on, we're sending out invitations to small business owners and trying to get them involved. We're also planning to do a similar kind of thing for nonprofits. I already did a call recently with religious leaders. I've done one with labor leaders. And so we are working really, really hard to try to both hear the voices of our community at this time, but then also reach back out to them. And so we did a mailer to over, I think it was, trying to remember how many people it went to, 150,000 homes, a coronavirus mailer that had a little card with the symptoms, the numbers you could call. It had our office information on it. And we're gonna continue to mail things out. We're also developing resource guides for constituents. They're one-page handy resource guides. The first one that we're rolling out is for seniors on changes in Medicare. The expansion of Medicare telehealth services, how Medicare has made it easier for you to fulfill prescriptions and get 90 days of your medication. And so that's the first one of these resource guides that we're rolling out. But absolutely, telephone town halls. We ring people's phones the day before and leave messages, and then we call people at the time of the town hall, and if they pick up, they are connected. And the comments that come in to telephone town halls or Twitter Live or Facebook, we do keep track of those and try to reach back out to people to get them answers to their questions, even if we don't have time to do it live during the event. So we've had very high participation, and we're going to continue to have those events going forward. I'm having one with Katie Petrie Norris tomorrow on unemployment and how to claim unemployment benefits and how Congress expanded unemployment relief. So Katie and I are joining together to do that event tomorrow.
Great. Okay. Baroni Chopra has a rather long statement and a question, so bear with me. What is the political will or courage to end financial abuses by or on government agencies such as Medicare fraud, pension loading in a final year, or over liberal disability awards to retiring military people, veterans usually, and double or triple dipping? I cannot even get my wife to inherit my Social Security payments because she was a school teacher. but other retirees can double dip on disability and pension payments even when they're not disabled. There seems to be an overuse of PTSD claims awarded freely. I cannot tell you how I know, but who is the oversight for such abuse?
Yep. So with regard to Social Security disability, there is an inspector general who is in charge of that program, and there have been some investigations into disability awards. One in particular looking at the incredibly high rate of disability approvals in Puerto Rico. And there's nothing particular about Puerto Rico, except that I think the judges in the process there were such that the rate of approval for disability was many degrees different than it was in other pockets of the country. So there is a need for robust oversight of this. I am aware of some of the issues with regard to teachers and others, and appreciate the Canyon Dems bringing that information to me and expressing their concern about that. I received your notes and your letters with regard to that. I think we have two problems that are existing in tandem though, and I want to tell you how I think about this. One of them is that we have an awful lot of people who are in these programs who desperately need them and for whom the benefits are not sufficient to make ends meet, particularly in a high cost of living area like Southern California. And so for people who are receiving food benefits, SNAP benefits, for instance, we've tried to increase that amount because we know people cannot purchase a healthy diet and sufficient food on the amount they're given. We're going to see a record number of people claim unemployment, and even though Congress has upped by $600 the amount of unemployment that the federal government will chip into states to pay for, there are going to be a lot of people in our area who are unable to make rent, for example, because the unemployment benefit is much lower than their salary. So that is a real and legitimate problem. It exists alongside the problem that you identify, which is that in any system, there will be a certain number of people who try to take advantage of it and try to cheat. We have this happening in our tax system with the richest people in America and the largest corporations in America engaged in widespread tax abuse. And yet we have a president and a Senate that will not fund, for example, fully funding the IRS audit department, which would generate hundreds of millions, billions of additional dollars for the federal treasury just by making sure everyone pays their fair share. So these inspector generals at these agencies, and the VA has an inspector general, Social Security Disability has them. They do very, very good oversight work, but each member of Congress also needs to conduct rigorous oversight. And what my office recently focused on is we dug into, as a staff, the publicly available export and import data. And what we found is during January and February of this year, when the administration should have been increasing the import of personal protective equipment, ventilators, etc., our exports to China went up by over 1,000%, and our imports fell by 10 or 11%. And so we can look at the data and see in those data that the Trump administration was failing to plan. We also looked at government contracting data, and we found that these promised deliveries of additional equipment from private companies that the president keeps touting and offering as an excuse for why he doesn't need to use the Defense Production Act, those deliveries and orders the government has placed for more personal protective equipment are not due to be delivered until September or October. I offer this is
I'm
very,
sorry.
Yeah, this is terrible, terrible news. But I offer it to you as an example of if you have talented staff and a member who supports and encourages and pushes staff, that what one member can learn by doing vigorous oversight. So that report is available. We posted about it on our Twitter account, I think on our Facebook account as well. But I encourage you to take a look at it. We've done similar kinds of oversight over DaVita and Fresenius with regard to dialysis procedure. So there's a lot that each member can and should be doing to deal with oversight as well. The last thing I just want to say is the research on benefits and sort of the problem of benefits being not generous enough for people to make ends meet, but then we have concerns about fraud or abuse. The research makes clear one thing. If you make the application process impossible, long, you really can cause death by 1,000 paper cuts. You really can end up killing people because they're unable to get the kind of housing, food, income, whatever assistance that they need by making the application too hard. And here's what's the most interesting part to me as a data-driven researcher. The level of cheating does not go down when you make the application harder. In fact, it goes up slightly, because what happens is people who are willing to cheat, they're willing to go to a lot of work to cheat. And these scams tend to be fairly sophisticated. So when you make the process and more onerous, you make it harder for people to apply, you end up pushing out the most needy, and the cheaters stay right there or even begin to increase a little bit. So we do have to have vigorous oversight, and we need to be figuring out how to design programs to prevent fraud and abuse. It's an important thing to safeguard our tax resources. It's something I take really seriously as a single mom for whom those tax payments, they really take a chunk out of my paycheck, and I feel it. But we want to make sure that we're not driving out the most needy in the system along the way, because that's not an effective strategy.
Okay.
And Louise, I think that's all the time that we have for questions.
Okay.
Let me just give a couple closing remarks.
Yes.
Louise, if you can feel free to send additional questions and names to us.
We've already done that. So
Super.
I'll, yeah.
So we
And I'll
appreciate
forward
that.
the emails for those last two people.
Wonderful. So thank you very much. I will tell you that as a junior member of the House Caucus, I get on a lot of 200 people conference calls and don't get a chance to ask my question. So I have a lot of sympathy for all of you who weren't able to speak tonight. But I just want to say again how important institutions like Kenyon Democrats are at a time like this. It's a scary time. The work that you all have done trying to support our community, the work that other organizations like the South Orange County Democratic Women, they've been making masks. I know you all have too. And I thought my kids and I made sack lunches on Easter evening that we took down to San Clemente, and 20 sack lunches that were picked up by homeless individuals who needed food that day. So there are a lot of opportunities to serve our community. Our campaign has largely shifted to doing that. Thank you to those volunteers who have been calling folks, doing wellness checks. We've also been raising money. We were able to raise over $50,000 with the help of our contributors for No Kid Hungry, support that organization. And so we're really doing our best to focus our campaign on serving the community during this time, and really appreciate having partners like Kenyon Dems in doing that. So thank you again for inviting me to be part of your evening. I can't tell you, I don't want to start naming names, but it's so wonderful. I have you all up here in grid view and have been swiping through, seeing so many smiling, familiar faces. But it's really, really important to continue your work during this period. So thank you, Kenyon Democrats, for having me tonight and for your continued leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
Thanks, everyone. It was so great to see everybody's faces. Have a great rest of your evening.